ISO FileMaker Magazine, the professional's resource for FileMaker know-how. Hey there, and welcome back to yet another tutorial video where we are going to learn more about FileMaker Pro and doing development. In this video, we're taking a look at UI transitions. These are how do you make things look really smooth on FileMaker Go or on an SDK app. So let's head over to my desktop and take a look at the file. All right, thanks for joining me here on my desktop. As you can see, I do not currently have FileMaker Pro or Claris Pro open. What I have is a copy of an application that I have on the App Store where this mobile application, any SDK application, is essentially using FileMaker Pro. Or FileMaker Go, I should say. And you are able to, Claris made this available for free, actually, to bind your FileMaker database into the FileMaker Go and release it as a standalone application. Now, in this application, what we are taking a look at is this right here. So when I click on the menu, first off, we're going to notice that the menu comes in and it flies in and it's really smooth. So I'll close that and let's see if we can get this again. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't, unfortunately. I'll have to explain a little bit about what FileMaker or what Claris did. Well, it was named FileMaker Incorporated at the time that they made these changes when they did them to mobile. But what we're trying to replicate or what we're trying to do on mobile is create a solution that looks and feels as similar as possible to a real iOS solution. Now, I'm going to select on this item right here, this events. And when I click on that, that's going to roll in. We have access to all of the smooth animations that FileMaker is going to do by default, but there are some situations where we have to take matters into our own hands. In this particular case, when I switch between past and upcoming, I want you to notice the transition. Notice that it's fading in and out, or it's doing a cross dissolve between the two. FileMaker does not support that natively, so that's what I'm going to be showing you in the remainder of this video. But there are also other places where you can take advantage of little features that FileMaker has that provides for really smooth transitions. So right here we've got this smooth transition, and as we move to move the menu, actually it happened right there. You'd have to put the video on slow motion. In fact, I'm going to go into it again and let you take a look at that. What we're looking at is we're looking at this area specifically where the cursor is, where the menu basically does a little shift in, and then the other part of the solution rolls in that we can see. Well, I'll click the menu and it will go out. And what we can see is you can see a little bit of that black right there and how it drops down. That's what I'm going to be explaining in this video. What are the layout parts that do what they do, certain things in terms of how Claris has implemented the transitions, but on top of that, it's basically how do you effectively take advantage of transitions when you're not even leaving a layout. So I'm not leaving a layout in here. I'm simply performing a find. When I go between past and upcoming, all this is a find that's actually finding everything that is prior to get current date, and then what is going to be in the future of relative to get current date. Now, another item that we have here is you'll notice that when I click on this little button that we have down at the bottom, this plus, I get this really smooth item that flows in that just takes advantage of the central area of what I have here, which is a court. So when I click out of that, it's going to fade away and fade in, and I'm going to talk about how you can take advantage of that as well. So let's head into talking about these. It's a really simple concept and script. They do it in the web all the time, but I'm going to show you how to do it in FileMaker. Hey there, this is Matt. Thanks for taking the time to watch my free videos on YouTube. This video has been sponsored by what we see on screen right here. Now, if you are looking for hosting, there's a ton of places that you can choose from, but I choose to go with FMCloud.fm, and I'll tell you why. They use the latest technology. Now, I haven't worked with other providers. They may be using the same technology, but I know the owner of FMCloud.fm, Fabrice Nordman. I trust him. I know he knows what he's talking about because his understanding of technology is absolutely solid. Now, these guys are using container-based technology. So every Every instance of your FileMaker server is completely isolated from another server. How does this benefit you? Well, because of that situation, they're able to provide all of the features, the full features of your FileMaker server. Now, if you go with some of the other providers, you may not have features that you would like to have, such as the ability to run your own plugins. And because each of these containers are isolated from each other, you really have a robust security setup. Now, if we take a look right here, just like any other provider, you can choose from all kinds of different places, anywhere across the globe that you might want to host your FileMaker database system so that your latency is low and all of your clients are connecting really close to your FileMaker server. So if you're looking to set up your own FileMaker server or maybe migrate from another provider, then take a look at the link that I have in the description or on the video or on screen right now at FileMakerMagazine.com/hosting, and we'll redirect you to FMCloud.fm, where you'll be able to take advantage of their great offers. All right, so the first thing I should mention, if you haven't been working with FileMaker for any amount of time, is where do you access the transitions? Well, the transitions themselves are on FileMaker's script steps of go to layout. Go to layout. There we have one of them, and we'll put in a go to related, which I'll put in right there by typing GTRR. So if you don't already know it, it's right there in front of us. It is right, the animation, it's there by default. Now, this doesn't happen on desktop, unfortunately. We do not have access to animations, but for any one of these animations that we specify, slide in from left, right, bottom, out to left, right, bottom, which is really easy. For simulating in iOS, something coming in and going out when you make menu selections, it is basically just whatever you're going to go in from, you're just going to go out from the same thing. So if you slide in from left, then you're going to slide out to left. That's all you're going to do in terms of making your selections. So if you do the right, choose the both rights. If you're going to do the left, choose both lefts. If you're going to do it from the bottom, bring it up, and then it will go out. Now, personally, I've never used the flip from right and flip from left. You're getting a little crazy on that, but the cross dissolve is something that's really pretty nice. And there are a few instances where you can use the zoom in, zoom out, depending on what your UI is doing. But for the most part, most of what I'm using are the sliding in from left and right and the bottom that we have. In fact, I'll show you those in my application here in terms of their use. Now, you also have access to these on the go to related. So when you specify the related, if you're going to a layout, a particular layout, in this case, we'll select this right here, we have the option to use the animation. And here it is again right there. Super easy, all the same thing. Now, it's key to understand that these animations you can use at any time, and we also have the ability to either enable or disable these, and it applies to other areas of FileMaker. So if we start to type in animation, we have this step that comes in that says set layout object animation on or off. Now, this doesn't apply as much to layouts. This applies more or less to what I'm going to show you, which is that box that I had appear. That is basically just a popover. So anytime that you have a popover come up, what you're able to do is that has a fade in, fade out transition when a popover is going to show. So you are able to explicitly turn that on or off, and that's typically going to be used when you're going to have a popover where you're either going to close that window or hide that window. As part of your script, you can use that step right there in order to control whether or not that transition happens. And again, it's predominantly on mobile, but this does work on desktop as well, at least as far as popovers are concerned. But when it comes to the animations, how can you do an animation on the same layout? Well, that's simply a matter of taking advantage of the fact that these exist, and this is something they do on the web that maybe you didn't even notice this. Many times when you open a mobile application that was designed for the web and it's using something like React, and they've wrapped, I forget what Electron, which is a way to take native web app designed in React, and then you can wrap that and make it native for both, I believe, Android or iOS. Well, what they're doing in that situation many times is they are using a placeholder layout. And I'm doing that exact same thing here in my solution in order to create this particular effect where when a particular item, when I'm on the same layout, in order to fade between these, what I'm doing is I'm going to a dedicated layout, which essentially simulates the areas that I want to have consistent. So what I'm highlighting there on screen is this top menu bar area. I want that to consistently show, and I want to go to a layout that's going to very temporarily seem like I'm on that layout, and then basically go back to the same layout that I had just left while using my own transition. So let's take a look at the script and see how that breaks down. All right, so we've moved into my FileMaker solution, and what we have here on the left is my normal layout. Now, the first thing that I want to talk about is the parts that I was talking about when I said you need to set the video that you're watching into super slow motion in order to see what is happening when Claris or FileMaker at the time when they implemented these had decided based on what happens in terms of a transition point with regards to the animation, and it breaks down like this. The top navigation part that we can see right here has a different animation effect than the rest of the layout parts. So the header is going to behave differently than the top navigation. And I don't know why they did this, and you don't have any control actually, but you can take advantage of the fact of knowing what FileMaker or what FileMaker, the app, or what Claris, the company, is doing in terms of the transitions. And this applies more on mobile. It doesn't affect your desktop because you don't see this. I wish they would implement it on desktop so you could do it, but for the most part, the layout switching itself is only on mobile. So what happens is the top navigation, it looks like that comes in and drops down while the rest of the layout either slides in from whatever you decide, left or right. So if the top is moving down while anything header and parts below it are actually moving in, you can actually take advantage of that in order to do some pretty interesting things. Let's say, for example, you have a layout and you just want it to have just a really cool effect. Well, take a top navigation part, and if you're not using it on mobile for the purpose that it was intended, which, by the way, you need to know this, the top navigation and likewise the bottom navigation are the only two parts in all of the part definitions or all of the list of available parts where those parts on mobile are fixed. So the top navigation and the bottom navigation are fixed at 100%. In other words, you cannot pinch and zoom them. They are always 100%, and they're always fixed based on 0, 0 coordinates, or if it's this way for you. So knowing that, you are able to use that to your advantage from a UI standpoint, designing a FileMaker Go solution or an SDK solution. And I could, for example, have this whole layout, the whole part, be a top navigation if I don't need to support pinch and zoom. Because from a UI display perspective, FileMaker doesn't entirely care unless you're using a list view. If you're using a list view, then of course you're going to have to use the body part. If you're just using a straight up form view for your layout, there is no consequence between using a full layout made of an entire top navigation portion versus a body portion. It's just a part. The only time that parts really come into play is when you're doing reporting, when you're doing list views, and some other situations. Otherwise, if it's a form view, the form view itself for FileMaker, any of the parts can support fields. So that's the first thing that we want to know. The second thing that we want to know is how do we take advantage of getting a transition to happen between the two? Because this is the one layout that I'm simply doing a find and switching between a past and an upcoming based on a particular date. So the key here is what you're typically going to do is replicate your layout. So you can see right here that I have a layout called transition. Now what I do is when I click on these buttons are triggering a script where I have a subscript that is saying perform transition. And we're going to take a look at that. And essentially what it's doing is it's going to a dedicated placeholder layout where I've replicated the top menu bar so that I don't get this really strong distortion. And I'm effectively calling the go-to layout. So I've left my main layout. I've gone to a layout that replicates any of the elements that I want to replicate, such as the header bar. Let's say, for example, you would want to, as I go into layout mode on this, let's say that you wanted to replicate some placeholders. And I know you've seen this on the web, where when you go to a website and it starts to load something, it has a placeholder of what that item looks like. Many times it'll have this sweeping effect that looks like it's got a glow going across it. You're essentially doing the same thing in FileMaker, where let's say, for example, on this layout, I had a contact or something, and it was using well, let's just use a rounded corner box for this, which we don't even need to use rounded corners anymore because FileMaker actually has the ability to put rounded corners on rounded corners. But for grins, let's just say I am going to go over to the design area here. I'm going to say that I have 7 points, and I'm going to make this a stronger rounded corner right there. So in essence, I would put my objects on my transition layout that mimic or look like what my actual layout is. When I go to the transition, if I force the layout to refresh and only do it for a split second of time, which I can do with a pause, which we can do this, we can put in a pause script step and change it from indefinitely and pause for however many fractions of a second we want. You can do 0.1, or you can do, I've been enjoying this one lately, is 1 divided by 1,000, because that's going to be 1,000th of a second, which is going to be extremely fast. If you wanted to reduce this, you can do, 1 divided by 2, or in other words, you could do 0.5, half of a second. So FileMaker is respecting these very short pause durations, but it's just enough for the eye to actually see that, and then you're starting the transition again. So what does the transition script look like? Well, let's take a look at that. All right, so here is what I am doing. I am simply taking advantage of the fact that the go-to layout script step itself allows me to specify a layout by name or a layout by number. So regardless of how you want to do this, I'm actually using a layout ID, the internal canonical ID. And if you have a question about that, search the FileMaker magazine website for layout ID. I have tons of videos about how to do this and why it's best to do this. I rarely ever use layout name by calculation, because the names of my layouts over the course of development, they always change. The internal IDs, they never change. You can't change them. Claris controls that completely within FileMaker or Claris Pro. So when we look at what I do, rather than using a go-to layout script step, I replace this with my own script of, we'll put in here, perform script, and I will hit this and I will type in transition, layout transition. So by performing a script of layout transition, and I'm just going to go over and copy the script that I use. In fact, this is what I do in a lot of my development. When you set up a script that has expected parameters, which in this case is this layout transition script, what I do up at the very top of the script is actually set a perform script calling that script itself with the parameters. Because then all I have to do is go to the script, copy the script, go back to my original one, and then paste it in. So rather than using go to layout, which I'll now make disabled, I will actually use this right here, layout transition. Now you can see the parameters that I'm passing as I bring them up, and we can see right here what I'm doing. I'm using the internal canonical ID. So let's say, for example, I'm heading to layout 50. And if you're using the Monkey Bread plugin, which I also have other videos on YouTube about the Monkey Bread plugin, but for the most part, I'm not putting in the name of the layout. I'm not saying go to layout contacts. Why? Because somewhere down the road, I may rename that to contacts whatever. And now my literal string has broken. But if I specify the layout by internal ID, I always hit the right layout. Well, the transition right here simply is just going to take the same names that I use, and I have them right here so that I can copy and paste them. If I want to cross dissolve, I copy that, and I'm passing that in as a parameter. So when we look at the script itself, you can see how simple it is. Let's go through this. When I call layout transition, what I'm passing into this script is the layout that I want to go to, but also the animation that I want to use. So I'm taking an inbound script parameter, which has multiple parameters in the format of JSON. I'm saying if the JSON isn't valid, then I really can't finish out with the rest of this script. So go ahead and exit, and you can see that I've got a to-do that I need to log this. But otherwise, I'm going to do some other script setup stuff. In this case, I have to get a layout ID. I will be able to determine whether that layout ID exists or not. In fact, you can see right here that I'm saying if the layout ID is blank, just exit the script. I can also determine whether or not the layout exists by testing to see whether or not it has been deleted, and that's a good idea as well. I am setting a transition value to if there is no transition value, meaning I didn't get anything from the transition, I'm going to set my default right there. So my default is to slide in from bottom. You would be able to set whatever you want as the default. Otherwise, we are taking what came inbound as a parameter value of what transition do we want to use. So I'm basically just saying I'm going to use a script to perform the transitions, and you can see that right here I am going to my placeholder layout. So this is where the layout, you've set it up to mock up what you're using as the transition. Now, in my solution for the menu that I'm drawing, I really only need the header bar. Maybe in your case, you need a transition layout that's going to mimic your contacts layout with what I just showed by drawing that rounded rectangle on the layout. And here, you're going to pass in also an additional parameter that you get to determine when you go to that transitional layout. Do you want to force that to refresh or not? And here you can see that I'm performing a refresh window and a refresh layout. Now I'll show you the refresh window. On mobile, FileMaker actually has a little bit of an issue, and this is historical information if you're interested. When FileMaker Go was initially developed, it was, I don't know that it was prior to, but it was right around the same time that FileMaker was implementing objects or named objects. So one of the things they did to optimize things on mobile was previously they were not refreshing a whole window because on mobile it was very costly. We didn't have M1 processors. The mobile devices were a little bit slower. Now the cost to you isn't as great, but a refresh window on mobile is more costly than if you're just refreshing specific objects. So it wasn't always a good idea to use refresh window. For me, on my solution, it is completely local to the device. So I don't have a problem calling refresh window, whereas a remote hosted solution, you may just want to call to refresh individual items. So my implementation of a refresh window, I almost always want, and there's a little bit of a bug in FileMaker Mobile because they really haven't been keeping up. iOS updates much more frequently than FileMaker or Claris does update FileMaker Go, and it's got some refresh issues, I'll be honest. I typically, when I call a refresh window, I also want to call or cause a pause resume to actually happen because that does, in some instances, depending on what you're doing, force a refresh. And this is because Claris made some smart choices where they weren't going to allow the refresh window when a script is calling another script is calling another script. They wanted to optimize that workflow where when you would go to a layout, if you didn't need to show anything on that layout and FileMaker just needed to go to that layout for context, they wouldn't refresh the layout. So you had to explicitly force it. So that's why I created a refresh window script that calls the pause resume and pauses for a fraction of a second in order to ensure that that refresh actually happened. So it's sort of like we had to go backwards and forcibly do the things that we want to do on mobile that FileMaker was trying to address by not refreshing things because of multiple subscripts being called. So this is a good thing to know about. Another thing that I have is I also have a refresh layout script here that I don't need to call the script. I'll open it up here by clicking on this. Are you going to open up? I guess it's not. Maybe it did somewhere else on screen. But essentially what this particular script does, this refresh layout, is when I get to a layout, I use a custom function. I ask for all of the named layout objects and only those named layout objects. FileMaker has a design function that will get all layout objects, but it has the greater than and less than signs wrapped around all of those. Well, I strip all of them out and I simply just walk across all objects that are currently on the visible screen, and that's what refresh layout does. So if I forcibly say to this layout transition script, hey, I want you to run a refresh, this is extremely exhaustive right here, running those two steps. They forcibly tell the layout, well, they're actually redundant in some regard. Right here, I believe I meant to have an else if in here at the time that I was using or implementing this, because I'm actually doing this in this solution in a slightly different way. But for the most part, refreshing the window is redundant to looking at all named objects on a layout and then just calling a refresh on all of those forcibly. How they differ internally, I'm not exactly sure, but I was doing both of them at the time of my testing when I implemented this. But the rest of the script is super simple. You can see right here, if you get an inbound value of slide in left, we're going to go to the layout of the layout name that we reverse encoded right here using these object layouts, where I took the internal ID, which is always correct and always valid. I reversed it to whatever the current name of the layout is, and then I go to that layout by layout name with the animation on, and that's how I get the transition. That is exactly what's happening when we look at this solution, and when I click between these two and we get this really nice smooth butter effect, that is what's happening. I am simply going to a placeholder layout, stopping for the briefest of seconds, and then coming back to this layout simply in order to use the cross-dissolve transition. And I'll tell you what, it's nice. It gives you a sense of control here within FileMaker, where normally when you click on this, if you perform a find, it's just very bland. It's very cut and dry. It's a hard cut, and it's not something that's as interesting on mobile, when most of the rest of your mobile solutions on iOS just have all kinds of effects and transitions that we just don't have access to within FileMaker. But doing this, you can take advantage, and you are causing your own layout transition. All right, and as a wrap up to this video, the only other things that we have access to in terms of transitions are popovers, but you can do some really cool things with popovers. They work on desktop and on mobile. So as I showed you before, the little plus icon that I have right here, one of the things that I'm doing, if it's not obvious, is when I click on this, I am simply using a popover that when that popover comes up, the popover itself is transparent, but the objects in the transparent popover are opaque. So in this case, we can see right here, clearly this area right here, this central area of what resembles a pickleball court. For me, I'm taking the opportunity to show a dialogue in that area, knowing that the popover itself has its own crossfade transition. And again, this is available on Mac or on Windows. And the great thing about popovers is that because you have access to the events of the popover, for example, the popover itself has an onObjectEnter trigger. I can determine what this button actually does, the plus button, in terms of the context. Now, in this particular context, what I'm simply saying is if this particular game that's currently loaded, if some other conditions are met, then what's going to happen to the popover is the popover itself will automatically always want to come up. But if the conditions are met, what I can do is I can immediately close the popover, and many times FileMaker, sometimes you can see it. It's extremely brief, but on the current mobile devices, many times it happens so fast, and I wish there was a control that we have, or a toggle somewhere where we'd be able to say whether or not the popover comes up, but every time the popover attempts to come up. But if we get rid of it really quickly, many times it's not even enough time to show on the screen. So what happens is I click this button, and if the popover shows up but the conditions are met, the popover goes away really quickly, and this button acts like a normal button and simply goes away. So if you remember that a popover provides you with transitions, and that you can use a popover and set the popover itself to be transparent, but yet control what's in the popover relative to anchoring. So in this particular situation, everything in this central area is it has no anchors. So it's floating in the middle, which when a popover opens, and it also is floating, and the contents of the popover are floating, they always hit the same point. So in other words, over here in the desktop, when I resize this, you can see that as I resize, everything in the middle here is all floating. So regardless of what happens when I resize, if I resize out it even more, the popover is always in the right place. And that's essentially what we're trying to achieve. And that's just one of the things that you can do in order to achieve some really nice effects. Now, it's super fast here on desktop, but you can see the fade in, fade out that happens. You can't really control the timing of that. There is no timing control that FileMaker has given us access to, but at least we get that transition effect, and knowing that we can do that, it makes our solutions just a little bit more tasty in terms of their UI sugar. And so that's what I have for this particular video. If you are interested in learning more about FileMaker, I have tons of videos over at FileMakerMagazine.com, and it is well worth the price of admission when I can provide you with code that you can immediately use that maybe it took me hours to write or create in a particular solution, and I just give it ready for you to use right away. So if you'd like to help me out and you don't want to subscribe to the magazine, then give me a thumbs up here on YouTube if you're watching it here on YouTube, and subscribe if you're interested, because I do post videos here for free on YouTube. Otherwise, I'd like to wish you much luck with your own FileMaker development, and until next time, happy FileMaking.
We hope you've enjoyed this video tutorial, and we'd like to say thank you for your subscription and your support. If you're not already a subscriber, head on over to www.filemakermagazine.com/subscribe for more information about the benefits of joining.